Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. I'm Andrew, 42, a software developer who thought I had a pretty good life, until I didn't. My wife, Jessica, and I have been married for 13 years. We've got an 8-year-old daughter, Madison, who's my whole world. If you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have told you our marriage was solid. Sure, we had our ups and downs like everyone else, but I never doubted Jessica was in it for the long haul. Turns out, I was wrong. It started with little things: Jessica being glued to her phone, laughing at texts she'd never share with me, work events that seemed to pop up out of nowhere, and a distance between us I couldn't bridge no matter how hard I tried. I chalked it up to stress. She's an HR manager at a law firm, and her boss, Eric, is demanding. At least that's what I thought. Then one night, I got a gut feeling something was off. She was in the shower, and her phone buzzed. It was a text from Eric. The message was intimate, to say the least. Can't stop thinking about last night. My heart sank. I didn't confront her right away. I couldn't. Instead, I started paying closer attention. Jessica lied. A lot. She'd tell me she was working late, but when I called her office, they'd say she left hours ago. She'd go out with friends, but Madison would mention she saw Mommy leaving in a fancy dress with no friends in sight. The lies stacked up until I couldn't ignore them anymore. One evening, I checked our shared credit card statement. There were charges for dinners at places I'd never been, a boutique hotel downtown, and gifts I never received. The pieces clicked into place, and I realized Jessica wasn't just lying, she was betraying us. But here's the thing: I didn't explode. I didn't confront her in some dramatic scene. I decided to play the long game. I started documenting everything: texts, emails, receipts. I needed proof, not just for me, but for Madison. She deserved a stable future, no matter how messy things got. Jessica had no idea. She carried on as if she wasn't tearing our family apart. And me? I went through the motions: cooking dinner, helping Madison with her homework, even smiling at Jessica's jokes. But inside, I was breaking. This was just the beginning. Things were about to get worse, but I wasn't going to let her destroy the life we built. Not without a fight. I spent the next few weeks piecing together the full story. Jessica was careless. She'd leave her phone lying around, thinking I'd never check. But I did. And what I found confirmed everything I feared. Her texts with Eric were sickening. Flirty banter, inside jokes, and explicit messages that left no doubt about what was going on. She sent him selfies too, pictures she never took for me. My chest tightened as I read her telling him she couldn't wait to see him again. But the worst part? They talked about Madison. Not directly, but in ways that cut deep. Jessica once told him, "Andrew's such a good dad, it makes this easier." Easier? That's what she called tearing apart her family? I felt like a fool. While I was playing the role of doting husband and dad, she was sneaking around behind my back. But instead of confronting her, I kept gathering evidence. I backed up her texts, took photos of the receipts, and even placed a small GPS tracker in her car. Extreme? Maybe. But I needed the truth. The tracker confirmed my suspicions. She wasn't going to yoga on Wednesday nights. She was meeting Eric at his condo. Each time, I'd see her car parked there for hours. It felt like someone was squeezing my chest every time I checked, but I kept my cool. Madison needed me, and I wasn't about to let my emotions derail what I was planning. One night, Jessica came home late, smelling like a mix of wine and expensive cologne. She kissed Madison goodnight and crawled into bed like nothing was wrong. As I lay there next to her, staring at the ceiling, I wondered how long she thought she could keep this up. I started prepping for divorce in secret. I contacted a lawyer, an old college friend who specialized in family law. He was blunt but compassionate, telling me what I needed to do: protect Madison, secure my finances, and get solid proof. Proof. That word haunted me. I already had a mountain of evidence, but something inside me craved a moment, a confession. Something undeniable. So, I decided to push things further. The opportunity came quicker than I expected. Jessica had a work retreat coming up, which I knew was just an excuse to spend a weekend with Eric. This was my chance to catch her red-handed. I called in sick at work and made plans to follow her. The weekend of her work retreat arrived. Jessica kissed Madison goodbye, telling her she'd bring back a souvenir from the resort. She kissed me on the cheek too, and it took everything in me not to flinch. As soon as she drove off, I dropped Madison off at my parents' place for the weekend. I told them Jessica had a work trip, and I needed to catch up on projects. It wasn't far from the truth. Then I got in my car and followed her. Jessica drove 2 towns over to a boutique hotel. Sure enough, Eric was already waiting in the parking lot, leaning casually against his sleek black Audi. She jumped out of her car and hugged him like a schoolgirl seeing her crush. They kissed right there in the open, completely oblivious to the world around them. I parked at a distance and snapped photos from my phone. They walked into the hotel hand in hand, laughing. My stomach turned. This was my wife, the mother of my child. But I swallowed the pain and kept my focus. I checked into the same hotel under an alias, paying in cash. My hands were shaking as I signed the register. After settling into my room, I waited. Hours passed before I saw them again, leaving the room Jessica had mentioned in her texts. I followed them to a restaurant nearby and watched as they laughed over wine and steak, leaning into each other like lovesick teenagers. I took more photos, documenting everything. The next morning, I followed them to a hiking trail where they held hands, stealing kisses along the path. The entire time, my phone captured their affair piece by piece. When I couldn't take it anymore, I headed back to the hotel, packed my bag, and left. I had enough. More than enough. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to storm into their room, yell, scream, and demand answers. But what would that do? It wouldn't change anything. Jessica had made her choice, and now I was making mine. The hardest part was going back to normal. When Jessica came home, she acted like nothing had happened. She hugged Madison tightly, handed her a cheap stuffed bear, and told her all about the boring work retreat. Madison was thrilled to have her mom back. Meanwhile, I smiled through gritted teeth, nodding along, pretending I didn't know. That night, I lay awake again. Jessica was sound asleep beside me, her betrayal weighing down the bed like an invisible third person. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making her hurt the way she'd hurt me. It was about protecting Madison and building a future for us, free from lies. The next day, I met with my lawyer. It was time to move forward. Meeting with my lawyer, Kevin, was the first time I felt like I had control over this nightmare. Kevin didn't sugarcoat things. He said divorces can get messy, especially with a child involved. But, he added, you're doing the right thing by documenting everything. This will help you protect Madison. We went over everything, my photos, the texts I'd backed up, the receipts. It was an airtight case of infidelity. Kevin explained that the evidence wouldn't just help me in court, it'd ensure I had the upper hand if Jessica decided to fight dirty. I didn't want that though. I wasn't out to ruin her. I just wanted custody of Madison and a clean break. The next step was financial prep. I opened a separate bank account and started diverting a small portion of my paycheck there. Nothing Jessica would notice, just enough to start building a safety net. I also pulled our financial records, looking for any debts or accounts I didn't know about. Thankfully, everything seemed straightforward. At least she wasn't bleeding us dry on top of everything else. Jessica continued living her double life, completely unaware of what I was doing behind the scenes. She'd go on her business dinners, and I'd make sure Madison and I had fun nights together, board games, movies, even baking cookies. Madison didn't know anything was wrong, and I wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. But then Jessica's perfect world started to crack. It began with Eric. Apparently, his wife, yes, he was married, found out about the affair. I overheard Jessica on the phone one night. Her voice panicked as she said, "Eric, what do you mean she knows? What did you tell her?" She spent the rest of the night pacing the kitchen, whispering furiously into her phone. The next day, Jessica looked exhausted, but she acted like everything was fine. I pretended not to notice. Inside, though, I wondered how much longer she could keep juggling these lies. A week later, Eric's wife sent an email to Jessica's boss, exposing the affair. It spread through her office like wildfire. By the time Jessica came home that evening, she was visibly shaken. "They suspended me," she admitted after dinner, her eyes avoiding mine. "There's been a misunderstanding at work." "A misunderstanding?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She hesitated. "It's nothing. Just office politics. I nodded, pretending to believe her, even though I knew the truth. The fallout had begun, and it was only going to get worse. While Jessica scrambled to keep her life from falling apart, I stayed steady, focused on my plan. I met with Kevin again to finalize the divorce filing. We agreed on a timeline. I'd serve her the papers after securing temporary custody of Madison. With Jessica's job in jeopardy and her affair well documented, the odds were in my favor. But there was still a part of me that hesitated. Not because I doubted my decision, I didn't. It was Madison. I couldn't stop thinking about how this would affect her. She adored Jessica, and I hated the thought of taking that from her. But what other choice did I have? Staying together wasn't an option, not anymore. I kept reminding myself, this wasn't just about me. It was about giving Madison the stable, honest life she deserved. And I'd do whatever it took to make that happen. It was a Tuesday evening when everything came to a head. Jessica had been unusually quiet for days, and I could tell the stress of her suspension was eating away at her. Meanwhile, I was finalizing the divorce papers, coordinating with Kevin to ensure everything was in place. Then, Jessica dropped a bombshell. We were sitting in the living room after putting Madison to bed. She was scrolling through her phone, and I was pretending to watch TV when she said, "Andrew, we need to talk." My heart raced. "What's on your mind?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. She hesitated, biting her lip like she was trying to decide how much to say. "Things at work are complicated. I might not have a job soon." I already knew that. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said evenly. "What happened?" "There's been accusations," she admitted, her voice faltering. "Someone's spreading lies about me and Eric." Lies. That word echoed in my head like a cruel joke. "What kind of lies?" She fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. "It doesn't matter. The point is, I'm going through a lot right now. I just need you to be supportive." Supportive. The nerve of her to ask that after everything she'd done. But I kept my composure. "Of course. Whatever you need." Jessica smiled weakly, clearly relieved by my response. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tell her I knew everything. But that wasn't part of the plan. Not yet. The next morning, I got a call from Madison's school. She'd been crying in class and asked to come home early. When I picked her up, she clung to me like her life depended on it. "Daddy, is Mommy okay?" she asked through tears. My stomach twisted. "Why do you ask, sweetie?" "She was yelling on the phone last night," Madison said, sniffling. "She sounded really mad and sad. I don't want Mommy to leave." I hugged her tightly, reassuring her that everything was fine, even though my heart was breaking. Jessica's actions were starting to affect Madison, and I couldn't let that continue. That night, I made my decision. No more waiting. No more pretending. It was time to act. The following day, I served Jessica the divorce papers. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, when I placed the envelope in front of her. She stared at it for a long moment before looking up at me, her face a mix of confusion and fear. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's what you think it is," I replied. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope and scanned the documents. "You're divorcing me," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Yes," I said firmly. "And before you say anything, I know about you and Eric. I know about the lies, the dinners, the hotel. I know everything." Jessica's face turned pale. "Andrew, Don't," I interrupted. "Don't insult me by trying to deny it." For a moment, she said nothing, just stared at me with tears brimming in her eyes. Then, she broke down. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Jessica," I said, my voice cold, "this isn't just a mistake. This is a pattern. You've been lying to me, to Madison, for months. And now it's over." She begged me to reconsider, promising to end things with Eric and go to therapy. But it was too late. The damage was done, and I couldn't unsee the betrayal. "I'm not doing this for me," I told her. "I'm doing this for Madison. She deserves better." Jessica didn't have a response for that. She just sat there, sobbing quietly as I walked away. After serving Jessica the papers, I braced myself for the fallout. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't going to be clean or easy. But I didn't expect how quickly her life would unravel. The first blow came the very next day. Jessica's suspension at work turned into a termination. Apparently, Eric's wife hadn't just exposed the affair, she'd gone scorched earth. Word spread through the firm, and their HR department decided Jessica was too much of a liability to keep on board. She came home with her termination letter crumpled in her hand, her face a mix of anger and despair. "This is all her fault," she snapped, pacing the living room. "She's ruining my life for something that's none of her business." I stayed silent, sipping my coffee. What could I say? She was reaping what she'd sown. A few days later, Jessica's friends began pulling away. I wasn't sure if it was because they found out about the affair or because Jessica's charm couldn't hold up under pressure. Either way, the phone calls and invites stopped. For someone who thrived on social connections, it was a heavy blow. But the worst was watching Madison. She was too young to understand the details, but she wasn't oblivious. Jessica tried to maintain her role as a loving mother, but Madison could sense the tension in the house. One night, as I tucked her into bed, she whispered, "Daddy, are you and Mommy mad at each other?" I kissed her forehead and said, "We're going through a tough time, sweetheart, but we both love you very much. That will never change." It was the truth, or at least part of it. No matter how much anger I felt toward Jessica, I couldn't deny that she loved Madison. I just wished she'd thought about that before risking everything. Jessica's begging escalated as the reality of divorce sank in. She tried everything: apologies, promises, even guilt. "Do you really want Madison to grow up in a broken home?" she asked one night, tears streaming down her face. "She already is," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You broke at the moment you decided to lie to us." Jessica started therapy, and I could see genuine regret in her eyes, but regret wasn't enough. Trust wasn't something you could patch up with a few sessions and a heartfelt apology. I stayed civil for Madison's sake, but I kept my distance. I moved into the guest room and started dividing our assets with Kevin's help. I wasn't looking to leave Jessica destitute, I just wanted what was fair, with Madison's future as my top priority. The custody arrangement was where things got tricky. Jessica wanted joint custody, but I argued for primary custody with visitation for her. "I'm not trying to take Madison away from you," I explained. "But she needs stability, and right now, I'm the one who can give her that." Jessica fought me on it, but she didn't have much leverage. Between her unemployment and the evidence of her affair, the scales were tipped in my favor. Kevin assured me that the court would likely side with me, especially since I'd been the primary caregiver during Jessica's late nights and work trips. Then came the bombshell I hadn't seen coming. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Jessica pulled me aside. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. "Andrew," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." "What now?" I asked, already dreading whatever she was about to say. "It's Eric," she began, her hands twisting nervously. He broke things off with me." I shrugged. "Not my concern." "No, it's not that," she said, shaking her head. "He told his wife about Madison." I froze. "What about Madison?" Jessica looked down at her hands, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "He says she might be his." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My mind raced, trying to process her words. "What are you saying, Jessica?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "We need a paternity test," she whispered. Jessica's words hung in the air like a weight I couldn't shake off. Madison might not be mine. The possibility sent a chill down my spine. My daughter, my sweet, innocent Madison, was the reason I got out of bed every morning. The thought that she might not be biologically mine felt like someone had ripped the floor out from under me. But I couldn't let her see my fear. "Not yet. We'll get the test," I said quietly. "As soon as possible." Jessica nodded, her face a mixture of guilt and dread. I could tell she wasn't sure what she wanted the results to say. Eric might have been her affair partner, but I was the one who had always been there, for her and for Madison. The next few days were a blur. I scheduled the paternity test, avoiding Jessica as much as possible in the meantime. Madison, thankfully, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. I kept our routine normal: homework, bedtime stories, and weekend trips to the park, while my insides twisted with anxiety. The day of the test came faster than I expected. Jessica and I drove to the clinic together, an awkward silence filling the car. She kept glancing at me, her eyes filled with unsaid words, but I couldn't bring myself to start a conversation. At the clinic, the nurse was kind but efficient. She explained the process as she swabbed Madison's cheek, then mine. Jessica had already submitted hers earlier. Madison thought it was all a game. She giggled when the nurse swabbed her mouth, asking if it tickled my cheeks too. I smiled for her sake, but my heart was in my throat. When it was over, Madison skipped back to the car, holding the lollipop the nurse had given her. Jessica and I walked behind her in tense silence. Once we were in the car, Jessica finally spoke. "Andrew," she began, her voice soft. "No matter what the test says, you're her father. You've always been her father." I clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. "We'll see." The next few days were agony. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were plagued with worst-case scenarios. What if Madison wasn't mine? What would that mean for us? For her? The results came on a Thursday morning. I opened the email alone in my office, my hands trembling as I clicked the attachment. My breath caught as I read the words. 99.99% probability of paternity. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me like a wave. She was mine. Madison was my daughter. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. That evening, I sat Jessica down. The test results came back, I told her. Her face paled. "And she's mine," I said firmly. "Madison is my daughter." Jessica's shoulders sagged in relief, and tears filled her eyes. "I'm so glad," she whispered. But I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. "This doesn't change anything," I said. "The divorce is still happening. And I'll still fight for primary custody." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I understand." For once, there was no argument. No begging. Just quiet acceptance. The test didn't fix everything, but it gave me the clarity I needed. Madison was my daughter, my family, my priority. And now, nothing was going to stand in the way of protecting her future. Now that the paternity test was settled, I felt a sense of relief, but it was temporary. There was still the matter of breaking the news to Madison. The divorce wasn't something I could keep from her forever, and I needed to handle it delicately. That weekend, Jessica and I sat Madison down in the living room. Jessica had been avoiding this moment, but I insisted we do it together. Madison deserved the truth, as much as an 8-year-old could handle. "Sweetie," I started, trying to keep my voice calm, "Mommy and I need to talk to you about something important." Madison looked up from her coloring book, her big brown eyes full of curiosity. "What's wrong?" Jessica took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Madison, you know how much Mommy and Daddy love you, right?" Madison nodded, her brows furrowing slightly. "Well," Jessica continued, her voice trembling, "sometimes grown-ups decide they need to live in separate houses. It doesn't mean they don't love each other or you. It just means they need space." Madison's eyes widened. "Are you and Daddy getting a divorce?" she asked bluntly. I swallowed hard, caught off guard by her directness. "Yes," I admitted. "But it's important for you to know that none of this is your fault. Mommy and I both love you very much, and that will never change." Madison's bottom lip quivered, and tears welled up in her eyes. "But I don't want you to get a divorce. I want us to stay a family." Jessica reached for her, but Madison turned to me, burying her face in my chest. I held her close, my heart breaking as she sobbed. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. "We're still a family, just a different kind. You'll always have me, and you'll always have Mommy." Jessica looked devastated, but she stayed quiet, letting me comfort Madison. Eventually, Madison's tears subsided, and she sniffled against my shoulder. "Will I have 2 rooms?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," I said, forcing a smile. "One at Mommy's and one at Daddy's. And you can decorate them any way you want." That seemed to cheer her up, at least a little. She wiped her eyes and nodded, her grip on me loosening. "Okay," she whispered. That night, Madison stayed glued to my side. We watched her favorite movie, ate ice cream, and talked about all the fun things we could do in her new rooms. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jessica stayed in her room for the rest of the evening. I could hear her crying through the walls, but I didn't go to her. She'd made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. The next step was moving out, and that was going to be another emotional hurdle. The day I moved out was heavier than I expected. Even though I'd been preparing for weeks, packing boxes, renting a small apartment close to Madison School, nothing could fully brace me for the moment I'd have to leave my home behind. Not just the physical space, but the life I thought we were building together. Jessica barely spoke to me that morning. She hovered near the kitchen, sipping her coffee while I loaded the last of my things into the car. Madison clung to my leg, quiet but teary-eyed. "Daddy, do you have to go today?" she asked, her voice trembling. I knelt down and took her hands in mine. "I do, sweetheart. But remember, this doesn't mean we won't see each other. I'll be picking you up from school, just like always, and you'll have your own room at my new place." She nodded, trying to be brave, but her lips wobbled. "Can I help you decorate it?" "Of course," I said with a smile. "It's going to be our special project." Jessica finally spoke as I stood up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Andrew, are you sure this is what you want?" I turned to her, tired of the half-apologies and empty promises. "It's not about what I want anymore, Jessica. It's about what's best for Madison, and this is the best way forward." Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. I gave Madison one last hug before stepping out the door, feeling the weight of her small arms around my neck like an anchor. The new apartment was modest but cozy, a 2-bedroom unit in a quiet complex with a little park nearby. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I spent the first few days setting up Madison's room, letting her pick out the curtains and bedding when she came over for her first weekend visit. Seeing her light up as we put up her posters made it all worth it. "Do you like it here, Daddy?" she asked as we hung a string of fairy lights above her bed. "I do," I said honestly. "Especially now that you're here." She grinned, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Jessica, on the other hand, wasn't adjusting well. Her job prospects were slim, news of her affair had spread beyond her old office, and Eric was nowhere to be found. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that his wife had filed for divorce, and he transferred to another state to start fresh. Jessica was trying to make amends, at least on the surface. She'd been more attentive to Madison, taking her to the park and helping with school projects. But the cracks were still there. Madison mentioned in passing that "Mommy cries a lot when you're not here," and it took everything in me not to let my anger show. Jessica called me one night, her voice heavy with frustration. "Andrew, I'm struggling here. I don't know how to do this on my own." "You're not on your own," I reminded her. "I'm here for Madison, and that's what matters." "You know what I mean," she snapped. I don't know. I just need help." I sighed, keeping my tone calm. "You're strong, Jessica. You'll figure it out. But we both know this is the only way forward." She didn't respond, just hung up quietly. I stared at the phone for a long moment, feeling a mix of pity and resentment. I wasn't her savior anymore, and I couldn't let her drag me down with her. That weekend, Madison and I went to the park near my apartment. She climbed the jungle gym, her laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I wasn't just moving out. I was moving forward. As the weeks turned into months, Madison and I settled into a rhythm. She stayed with me every other weekend and a few evenings during the week. It wasn't ideal. I hated saying goodbye when I dropped her off at Jessica's, but I made every moment we had together count. Jessica, meanwhile, was struggling. Her unemployment stretched on, and her attempts to rebuild her social circle fell flat. I wasn't happy about her suffering, but I wasn't going to rescue her, either. She'd made her choices. One evening, as I helped Madison with her math homework, she looked up at me with a thoughtful expression. "Daddy, do you think Mommy is sad because you're not at the house anymore?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" "She cries sometimes," Madison said softly. "She tries to hide it, but I hear her." I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Mommy is going through a tough time right now," I said carefully. "But that's not your fault, okay? And it's not something you need to worry about." Madison nodded, but I could tell the answer didn't satisfy her completely. I hugged her tightly, silently vowing to do everything I could to shield her from the fallout of Jessica's actions. Jessica wasn't done trying to mend things, though. One afternoon, while Madison was at a friend's birthday party, Jessica called me. "Can we meet?" she asked. I hesitated. "What's this about?" I need to talk to you. Please." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a small cafe near her house, a neutral ground where emotions were less likely to boil over. She looked tired, her face drawn and pale, but she still carried that air of defiance I'd come to expect. "What's on your mind?" I asked after the small talk fizzled out. Jessica fiddled with her coffee cup. "I want to make things right," she said finally. For Madison. For us. I raised an eyebrow. Jessica, there is no us. Not anymore. She winced, but she didn't back down. I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed our marriage. But I want to fix what I can. I don't want Madison to grow up thinking we hate each other. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I don't hate you, Jessica. I'm angry. I'm disappointed. But hate? No. You're still Madison's mom, and I'll always respect you for that. But there's no fixing what's broken between us. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded. I understand, she whispered. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Then, as if a dam had burst, she started talking, about the affair, about her regrets, about how lost she felt. I listened, not out of sympathy, but because it felt like closure. When she was done, I stood up. I appreciate you saying all that, I said. But I'm focused on moving forward. You should do the same. Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she said quietly. That evening, Madison and I built a pillow fort in the living room of my apartment. As we sat inside, sharing popcorn and giggling at her silly jokes, I felt a sense of clarity. The past was a mess, but the future was mine to shape. And for Madison, I was determined to make it a good one. The weeks after moving out were a mix of challenges and small victories. Madison adjusted better than I expected, which was a relief. She spent weekdays with Jessica and weekends with me, though she always seemed happiest when we were together. Jessica, on the other hand, was struggling. She'd lost most of her support system, her friends had distanced themselves, and the fallout from her affair had left her isolated. I tried not to let it affect me, but it was hard to ignore when Madison would come over and casually mention, "Mommy doesn't eat dinner sometimes," or "Mommy's always on the phone crying." It wasn't my responsibility to fix Jessica anymore, but Madison's well-being was still tied to her mother's stability. I started offering more time with Madison, hoping to take some of the pressure off Jessica. At first, she resisted. "I can handle it," she snapped during one of our exchanges. "Jessica, this isn't about you," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "It's about Madison. If you need time to get your life together, just say so." She hesitated, her expression softening. "I'm trying," she said quietly. "I really am." I didn't push further. Whatever Jessica was going through, she needed to face it herself. My focus was on creating a stable, happy environment for Madison. Madison and I began to settle into our new routine. Weekends at my place were filled with activities, bike rides, trips to the park, movie nights with popcorn. Her room became her sanctuary, decorated with everything she loved, bright colors, fairy lights, and a stuffed animal collection that grew every time we went to the store. One evening, while we were painting a birdhouse together, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, I like it here." Her words warmed my heart. "I like it here too," I said. "Do you think Mommy will ever come visit?" she asked, tilting her head. I paused, caught off guard. "I don't know, sweetheart. But this is your space. You can invite her if you want." Madison nodded, satisfied with my answer, and went back to painting. Meanwhile, Jessica's situation continued to spiral. She called me one evening, her voice raw and shaky. "I need to talk," she said. "What's going on?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "I lost another job," she admitted. "I'm barely keeping things together, Andrew." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," she said quickly. I don't know what to do anymore. I'm sorry for everything, for Eric, for hurting you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to say it." Her apology caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Jessica," I said finally, "I appreciate you saying that. But the best thing you can do now is focus on Madison. She needs you." "I know," she whispered. "I'll try." Despite Jessica's struggles, I found myself growing stronger. Each day felt like a step further away from the betrayal and pain. I started reconnecting with old friends, picking up hobbies I'd let go of during the marriage. One Saturday, Madison and I spent the morning hiking a nearby trail. She held my hand as we climbed to the top, her excitement infectious. "Look, Daddy," she said, pointing to the view. "It's so pretty." "It sure is," I said, smiling down at her. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. Over the next few months, Jessica's life continued to unravel, and as much as I wanted to stay detached, it wasn't easy. Madison's well-being came first, and Jessica's struggles were starting to spill into her time with our daughter. Madison began showing signs that she was noticing the cracks in her mother's facade. "Mommy's always tired," she said one evening while we were reading together. "She doesn't play with me as much anymore." "What do you do when Mommy's tired?" I asked gently, not wanting to pry too much. "I just play by myself," Madison said with a shrug. "It's okay. She always says she's sorry later." That hit me harder than I expected. I knew Jessica was trying, but it wasn't enough. I called her that night after Madison was asleep. "Jessica, we need to talk," I said. "What now, Andrew?" she replied, her voice defensive and weary. "Madison's noticing things. She's saying you're tired all the time and that you don't play with her. Are you okay?" Jessica sighed heavily. "I'm doing the best I can, okay? It's hard being alone." "You're not alone," I said firmly. "We're co-parenting, and I've offered to help. If you need more time to get yourself together, say so." She was silent for a long moment before finally admitting, "Maybe you're right. I need to figure things out." We agreed to adjust the custody arrangement temporarily. Madison would spend more time with me while Jessica worked on getting back on her feet. Madison adjusted quickly to the change. She thrived in the stable environment at my apartment, and I loved having her around more often. We built routines: homework at the dining table, evening walks around the neighborhood, and Sunday morning pancakes. Jessica, however, seemed to sink deeper into her struggles. One afternoon, she called me in tears. "I got an eviction notice," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm behind on rent, and I can't make the payments." I pinched the bridge of my nose, frustrated but not surprised. "What's your plan?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. I don't know what to do anymore." Part of me wanted to tell her this was her mess to clean up, but I couldn't. Not entirely. For Madison's sake, I offered to help her find resources, housing programs, financial counseling, anything that could give her a fresh start. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't deserve your help, but thank you." Despite everything, Madison remained my focus. She was thriving in school, making friends, and smiling more often. One evening, as we were building a Lego set together, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, I like being here with you." "I like having you here," I replied, smiling. "Do you think Mommy will be okay?" she asked, her voice soft. "I think so," I said. "She's going through a tough time, but she loves you, and she'll figure things out." Madison nodded, satisfied with my answer. But deep down, I wondered if Jessica really could turn things around. Jessica's struggles worsened before they improved. She called less frequently, and when she did, her voice was always distant. I found myself worrying, not just for her but for Madison. As much as I wanted to distance myself from Jessica's problems, I couldn't ignore how they might affect our daughter. One afternoon, Jessica called me while I was at work. Her voice was trembling, barely above a whisper. "Andrew, I need your help." "What's going on?" I asked, stepping into an empty conference room. "They're locking me out of my apartment," she said, choking back a sob. "I've tried everything, but I couldn't make the rent. I don't know where to go." I sighed, pressing my fingers to my temples. "Jessica, this isn't sustainable. You need to get help, real help." "I know," she whispered. "But I can't do this alone." After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day making calls. I connected her with a local housing program and a non-profit that offered financial counseling. I didn't do it for her, I did it for Madison. She needed her mother to be stable, even if Jessica and I were no longer together. That evening, I picked Madison up from school as usual. She climbed into the car, her backpack bouncing against the seat. "Daddy, is Mommy okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "She's having a tough time," I admitted. "But we're helping her, and she's going to be okay." Madison nodded, though I could tell she was still worried. Jessica eventually moved into temporary housing through the program I found for her. It wasn't much, but it gave her a chance to start over. She seemed more humble now, more willing to accept the consequences of her actions. One evening, she called me to thank me. "Andrew, I know I don't deserve your help after everything I've done. But I'm grateful. Really." I didn't respond right away. A part of me wanted to say, "You're right, you don't." But that wouldn't have helped anyone. I'm glad you're trying to get back on your feet, I said finally. Jessica was quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you think we'll ever be friends again?" I paused, considering my answer. I think we can be good co-parents. That's what matters right now. Meanwhile, my life with Madison continued to flourish. She was the bright spot in everything, a constant reminder of what I was fighting for. One weekend, we decided to tackle a project together, building a treehouse in the park near my apartment. I'd cleared it with the complex manager, and Madison was thrilled at the idea. "You mean I get my own secret clubhouse?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. "Exactly," I said, laughing. "But you have to help build it." Over the next few weekends, we worked together, hammering nails and painting the walls bright blue. It wasn't the most elaborate structure, but it was ours. "This is the best thing ever, Daddy," Madison exclaimed as she climbed into the finished treehouse. Watching her smile, I realized that for all the pain and betrayal, I'd gained something priceless, a deeper bond with my daughter and a renewed sense of purpose. Jessica's journey wasn't over, and I had a feeling there were still challenges ahead. But for now, Madison and I were building something stronger than what we'd lost, a new kind of family. Despite the housing program's help, Jessica wasn't improving as quickly as I'd hoped. Madison would mention how "Mommy cries a lot," or how dinner at her house was often cereal. It broke my heart, but I kept my focus on providing stability. One evening, Jessica called. Her voice was shaky. "Andrew, I'm struggling. I feel like I've ruined everything." "Jessica, you need to take this seriously," I said firmly. "Have you followed up with the counselor I referred you to?" "No," she admitted. "But I will. I promise." Her promises were empty so many times before, but I knew Madison needed her mom, even if she was broken. A week later, Jessica fainted at her job. Madison told me, worried, "Mommy didn't eat lunch all week, Daddy." I called Jessica immediately, furious. "This isn't okay. You need to take care of yourself, or you're going to lose Madison entirely." For once, she didn't argue. "I know," she whispered. "I'll do better." It felt like rock bottom, but maybe that's what she needed. Jessica started therapy and took on fewer hours at work. Slowly, she seemed more grounded. She was far from perfect, but she was making an effort. For Madison's sake, I supported her progress, even as I maintained my boundaries. The storm was passing. Finally, it felt like we could all breathe again.